In January of 1941, somewhere in the highlands of Eritrea, a British officer filed a report that his commanding general would read twice before setting it down. It described an attack that made no tactical sense. A column of armored cars and infantry, modern, mechanized, the full weight of the British imperial war machine moving through the Horn of Africa had been charged. Not bombed, not ambushed from a ridge. Charged by horsemen, riding at full gallop directly into the vehicles, firing rifles and throwing grenades, screaming something in Arabic that none of the British soldiers could translate in time to respond properly. By the time anyone understood what was happening, the horsemen were gone. They left behind dead soldiers, damaged vehicles, stolen weapons, and a silence that felt, one witness later wrote, almost insulting. The British began asking questions. Who was doing this? Who, in the year 1941, was leading cavalry charges against armored columns? The answer, when it finally came, didn't make the situation less strange. It made it stranger. His name was Amedeo Guillet. He was 31 years old. He was an Italian aristocrat, and he had, by that point, already been declared dead. To understand how Amedeo Guillet ended up charging British tanks on horseback in the Eritrean desert, you have to understand something about who he was before the war, and, more importantly, who he believed himself to be. He was born in 1909 into a family with deep military roots in northern Italy. He rode horses before he could properly read. He fenced competitively, seriously enough to represent Italy at an international level. He trained as a cavalry officer at a time when most of Europe's military strategists had already concluded that cavalry was finished, that the horse had no place in modern industrial warfare. Guillet either didn't believe that or didn't care. He was sent to East Africa in the late 1930s, to Italy's colonial holdings in Eritrea and Ethiopia, territory that Mussolini had seized through brutal force just a few years earlier. This is a part of the story that deserves honesty. Guillet served an empire, a fascist one, that had used chemical weapons and committed massacres in its conquest of Ethiopia. He was not fighting on the right side of history in any broad moral sense. He was a professional soldier who served where he was told to serve. But something happened to him in East Africa that he hadn't anticipated. He fell in love with the land. He learned Amharic. He learned Arabic. He spent time with local communities in ways that most Italian officers simply did not. He formed a unit, the Gruppo Bande Cavallo, made up almost entirely of Eritrean and Yemeni cavalry fighters who chose, for reasons that were partly economic and partly something harder to name, to follow him. These were not conscripts. They were men who had looked at this Italian officer and decided he was worth their loyalty. That fact alone tells you something about the kind of commander he was. By 1940, Guillet commanded roughly 2,500 men on horseback. He had a purebred Arab stallion named Sandor that he had brought from Italy, and he was, by most accounts, genuinely content. In the strange, morally compromised way that soldiers sometimes find contentment in a place that should make them uncomfortable. Then the British arrived in force, and everything changed. The East African Campaign of 1941 is not one of the most studied theaters of the Second World War, but it was decisive and it was brutal. Britain moved into Italian East Africa from multiple directions, from Kenya, from Sudan, and from the sea, with a combined force that included British regulars, South African troops, Indian Army divisions, and Sudanese fighters. They were well supplied, well commanded, and fighting against an Italian colonial army that was isolated, undersupplied, and increasingly cut off from any hope of reinforcement. Mussolini's East African Empire was not going to survive 1941. The only real question was how long and how costly the collapse would be. For most Italian commanders, the arithmetic was clear enough. When the lines broke, when the positions became untenable, the professional thing, the rational thing, was to surrender. Tens of thousands of Italian soldiers did exactly that. The British, to their credit, were largely decent captors. The war would end eventually. A man could survive in a prisoner of war camp and come home. Amedeo Guillet did not accept this arithmetic. There are different ways to explain why. Some historians emphasize his personal code, a cavalry officer's pride, an aristocrat's refusal to accept humiliation, something almost medieval in his sense of honor. Others point to his bond with his Eritrean soldiers, who could not expect the same relatively comfortable captivity that Italian officers might receive. If he surrendered, what happened to them? Probably the truest answer is simpler and more irrational than either explanation. Guillet could not make himself stop. The war wasn't over for him. It just wasn't. The charge at Keru in January of 1941 is the moment that most accounts return to when they try to explain what Guillet actually did. A British column was moving through a narrow pass in the Eritrean highlands. The column included infantry, armored cars, and artillery. A significant force moving with the confidence of an army that had been winning for weeks and expected to keep winning. Guillet watched them from the ridge above. What he did next was, by any conventional military logic, suicidal. He ordered a full cavalry charge directly into the column, not a flanking raid, not a quick strike on the supply wagons at the rear. A charge, horses at full gallop, downhill, directly into armored vehicles. The British soldiers were, by their own later accounts, completely unprepared for this. Not because they couldn't see it coming, they could, but because nothing in their training or their experience had prepared them for the specific psychological impact of several hundred horsemen riding straight at them at full speed, screaming, firing, throwing grenades, utterly committed to the charge. The attack succeeded, in the sense that it inflicted casualties, disrupted the column, created chaos, and allowed Guillet's forces to withdraw with captured weapons and supplies. It did not succeed in the larger sense of stopping anything. The British column reorganized. It continued its advance. It was, strategically, a pinprick against a force that was not going to be stopped by cavalry charges. But the British didn't forget it. They couldn't. Reports went up the chain of command. Descriptions circulated. Someone, at some point, gave him the name. Il Diavolo, the devil. Comandante Diablo in Spanish, the language in which some of the communications traveled between different Allied forces. In English, officers began referring simply to the Devil Commander. A bounty was placed on his capture. He was, at this point, still fighting a conventional guerrilla war. Hit the convoys, disappear into the hills, strike again somewhere unexpected. He knew the terrain. His Eritrean soldiers knew it better. For weeks, he frustrated a much larger force through mobility and surprise, and the sheer audacity of refusing to behave like a defeated army. But attrition is mathematics, and the mathematics were not on his side. Over the following months, his force was systematically reduced. Men were killed, men were captured, men, in some cases, simply drifted away. The war clearly lost, the personal loyalty to Guillet genuine, but not infinite. He ran out of ammunition. He ran out of food. He ran out of horses. By mid-1941, the Gruppo Bande a Cavallo had ceased to exist as a military unit. Guillet was alone, on foot, in the middle of a desert, with the British Empire actively looking for him. This is the part of the story that sounds like fiction and isn't. He had two options, as he understood them: surrender and enter captivity, or disappear. He chose to disappear, but disappearing in East Africa in 1941, when your face had been described in military dispatches and there were reward posters circulating in the villages, required more than simply walking away. It required becoming someone else entirely. Amedeo Guillet became Ahmed. The specific name varies slightly in different accounts, but the transformation was systematic and extraordinary. He darkened his skin using local plant dyes. He dressed in Yemeni working clothes. He spoke Arabic that he had actually learned, not performed, in the local dialect of the communities through which he was moving. He traveled in the open, not hiding, because hiding draws attention. He was Ahmed, a laborer, a wanderer, someone unremarkable enough that British patrols looked past him. He spent months crossing the most hostile terrain in the Horn of Africa. On foot, through the heat of the lowlands, through territory where a wrong turn or a wrong word to the wrong person meant capture or death. He moved through villages and trading posts and temporary camps, always as Ahmed, always visible, always holding the performance together. The British, on at least 2 occasions, questioned him, spoke to him directly, looked at his face, did not recognize him. Think about what that required, not just the physical disguise, not just the language, the psychological discipline of being completely and without any slip, a person who does not exist, while people who are actively hunting you look directly at your face, while your own exhaustion and fear and hunger are present in your body, needing to be held still, needing not to show. He eventually reached the coast of Eritrea and found passage across the Red Sea to Yemen. In Yemen, the story takes one more unexpected turn. Guillet arrived in a country that had nothing to do with the war he had been fighting. He had no money, no documentation, no obvious reason for being there. He was, in practical terms, a stateless fugitive with a sunburned face and the worn-down body of a man who had spent months surviving a desert on foot. Through a combination of circumstances that his later accounts describe with characteristic understatement, he ended up making contact with the Imam of Yemen, Yahya Mohammed Hamid Eddin, the ruler of an isolated, medieval theocratic state that had almost no contact with the outside world. The Imam, by all accounts, found Guillet interesting, an Italian cavalry officer who spoke Arabic, who had fought the British, who had lived for months as a Yemeni laborer. This was not a kind of person the Imam had encountered before. Guillet spent time in Yemen under the Imam's protection. He learned more. He observed. He recovered in the ways a person recovers from something like that. Not fully, probably, not in the way that people talk about recovery now, but enough to eventually find a way to move again. He crossed back through the region under various disguises and identities, eventually making contact with Italian consular networks in neutral countries, and from there, finally, made his way back to Italy. By the time the war in Europe ended in 1945, Amedeo Guillet was home. He was 35 years old. After the war, Guillet did something that many people who had lived through what he had lived through did not do. He kept going. He joined the Italian diplomatic service. He became an ambassador. He served in Egypt, in Jordan, in Morocco, in India. He returned in a professional capacity to the Middle East that had sheltered him when he was running for his life. He spoke of the people who had helped him. The anonymous villagers, the traders, the ordinary men and women who had looked at a frightened Italian in bad disguise and chosen not to betray him, with a gratitude that seemed genuine and specific and not at all performative. He also, eventually, found himself in contact with some of the British officers who had hunted him. This is one of the details that stays with you. Years after the war, Guillet met with men who had put a bounty on his capture, who had filed the reports describing the devil commander, who had tried seriously and professionally to either kill or imprison him, and by most accounts, these meetings were warm, respectful, sometimes even fond. There is something in that which resists easy explanation. These men had been trying to kill each other in the desert. Now they were drinking tea and talking about the horses. The British military, with a particular institutional honesty that they sometimes manage about their enemies, had come to regard Guillet not with contempt, but with something closer to admiration. He had been, in their professional judgment, an exceptional soldier. The fact that he had been fighting for the wrong side, or at least the losing side, did not change their assessment of his conduct. One of Guillet's longtime admirers was the British journalist and biographer Sebastian O'Kelly, whose book brought this story to a wider English-speaking audience in the early 2000s. O'Kelly described Guillet as one of the last true cavalry officers, a man out of a different century, operating in a war that had no use for him, refusing to accept that fact. That framing is romantic, and Guillet would probably have accepted it with the slight embarrassment of a man who knows he is being flattered, but doesn't entirely disagree. Amedeo Guillet died in Rome in 2010. He was 100 years old. 100 years old. He had been born into a world of horse-drawn carriages and died in a world of smartphones and drone warfare. He had fought a war on horseback against tanks, disguised himself as a Yemeni laborer to escape capture, befriended an Imam in a medieval kingdom, and then spent 4 decades as a diplomat navigating the post-war Middle East. He outlived his enemies, outlived most of his comrades, outlived several of the countries that had fought over the territory where he once rode. At his funeral, there were Italian officials and former military officers and diplomats. There were also, and this seems right, somehow, men who had served under him, or whose fathers had served under him, from Eritrea and Yemen. Old men who had come a long way to stand in a Roman church for someone they had followed into impossible situations 60 years before. There is a question that sits at the center of this story, and it's worth sitting with rather than answering too quickly. Guillet fought for a fascist empire. The Italian conquest of Ethiopia was a crime, a colonial atrocity carried out with poison gas and deliberate brutality against a civilian population. The empire he served when he rode against the British was built on that crime. He knew this. He was not ignorant of what Italy had done in East Africa. And yet, the Eritrean soldiers who followed him chose to follow him. The Yemeni villagers who helped him escape chose to help him. The British officers who hunted him chose afterward to respect him, whatever moral clarity we might want to impose on his story from a distance. The people who actually knew him seemed to find him more complicated than his allegiances. That doesn't resolve anything. It's not supposed to. What it suggests, maybe, is that the Second World War, like all wars, was not only a conflict between ideologies or empires or economies. It was also millions of individual human beings, each carrying their own specific moral weight, making decisions under conditions of extreme pressure and uncertainty. Some of those decisions admirable, and some terrible, and some like charging tanks on horseback, because you simply cannot make yourself stop. So strange that they resist any category entirely. Guillet never fully explained himself. In interviews in his later years, he talked about loyalty, to his men, to his horse, to something he called his duty, though he was vague about who exactly he owed that duty to. He didn't claim to have been right. He didn't claim to have changed anything. The British won. Italy lost. The empire he fought for dissolved into history. He just said those were his men. That was his horse. That was the ground under his feet. And when the order came to stop, he didn't hear it. Or he heard it and decided it wasn't meant for him. Somewhere in the Eritrean highlands, in the January cold of 1941, a British soldier wrote in his diary that he had seen something he would never quite be able to explain. A horseman, riding through smoke and gunfire at full gallop, disappearing back into the hills before anyone could stop him. Moving like he owned the ground. Like the war was something happening around him, not to him. The soldier didn't know his name yet. Nobody on the British side did. They would learn it soon enough.